Chapter 17. A New Kind of Animal. The case I've presented in this book suggests that humans are undergoing what biologists call a major transition. Such transitions occur when less complex forms of life combine in some way to give rise to more complex forms. Examples include the transition from independently replicating molecules to replicating packages called chromosomes, and the transition from different kinds of simple cells to more complex cells in which these once distinct simple cell types came to perform critical functions and be entirely mutually interdependent, such as the nucleus and mitochondria in our own cells. Our species' dependence on cumulative culture for survival, on living in cooperative groups, on alloparenting and a division of labor and information, and on our communicative repertoires, means that humans have begun to satisfy all the requirements for a major biological transition. Thus, we are literally the beginnings of a new kind of animal. By contrast, the wrong way to understand humans is to think that we are just a really smart, though somewhat less hairy, chimpanzee. This view is surprisingly common. Understanding how this major transition is occurring alters how we think about the origins of our species, about the reasons for our immense ecological success, and about the uniqueness of our place in nature. The insights generated alter our understandings of intelligence, faith, innovation, intergroup competition, cooperation, institutions, rituals, and the psychological differences between populations. Recognizing that we are a cultural species means that, even in the short run, when genes don't have enough time to change, institutions, technologies, and languages are co-evolving with psychological biases, cognitive abilities, emotional responses, and preferences. In the longer run, genes are evolving to adapt to these culturally constructed worlds, and this has been, and is now, the primary driver of human genetic evolution. This is quite different from the usual story. The standard picture of human evolution proposes a long, fairly boring period of genetic evolution that culminated in an explosion of innovation and creativity sometime after 100,000, 50,000, or 10,000 years ago, depending on whom you hear it from. After this, genetic evolution seems to stop and cultural evolution takes over. Culture is then divorced from brains and biology, as well as from genetics, and the rest is history. More recent efforts to apply evolutionary thinking to human brains, biology, and behavior have made substantial progress, but these approaches still often portray a one-way causal avenue. To the degree that these older evolutionary approaches recognize culture or cultural evolution, they are seen as relatively recent phenomena, which, at most, scratch at the surface of a large core of human nature that emerged through purely genetic evolutionary processes. In 21st century textbooks on evolutionary psychology, for example, culture is often politely acknowledged and then waved off as being mostly relevant for explaining phenomena like the hula hoop craze, changes in clothing styles or fashions, beliefs about alien beings, and jokes. While a big advance on prior non-evolutionary views, where culture existed in some ethereal sphere disconnected from genes and biology, these older evolutionary approaches are still off the mark. As we've seen, phenomena like hula hoops could be replaced by Inuit snow houses, adaptive food taboos, composite bows, divination rituals that improve hunting, and the know-how to locate water in the Australian desert. That is, things that directly influence our species' ability to survive as hunter-gatherers. It's not just that these older approaches fail to consider some minor influences of culture on biology, or some recent and rare feedback loops showing how cultural practices, like drinking cow's milk, have shaped genetic changes. These now outdated evolutionary views fail to recognize that the central force driving human genetic evolution for hundreds of thousands of years or longer has been cultural evolution. The consequences of this run deep and wide. Many aspects of our physiology and anatomy make sense only as genetically evolved responses to selective pressures created by the cultural evolution of things like fire, cooking, cutting tools, projectile weapons, water containers, artifacts, tracking know-how, and communicative repertoires. Among other numerous features, these help explain our small teeth, short colons, shrunken stomachs, poor plant detoxification abilities, accurate throwing capabilities, nuchal ligaments, head stabilizer for running, numerous eccrine sweat glands, long post-reproductive lives, lowered larynxes, dexterous tongues, whitened sclera, and enlarged brains. Reference chapters 5 and 13. Many of our cognitive abilities and biases make sense only as genetically evolved adaptations to the presence of valuable cultural information. Chapters 4, 5, and 7. These evolved mechanisms include our well-honed cultural learning abilities, over-imitative tendencies, and folk biological capacities for organizing and enriching what we learn about plants and animals, among many others. Much of our species' status psychology, including our deferential motivations, patterns of mimicry and imitation, facets of pride, cooperative tendencies, and bodily displays, appear to be genetically evolved adaptations to a world in which valuable cultural information was unevenly distributed across the minds of other members of our social groups. Chapter 8. Our social psychology appears designed for navigating a world with social rules and reputations, where learning and complying with these rules is paramount, and where different groups possess quite different norms. Chapters 9 through 11. We internalize costly norms as goals in themselves, usually via cultural learning, and are particularly good at spotting norm violators, even when those violations have nothing to do with cooperation. To make sure we learn the best norms for our own groups and avoid the dangers of miscoordinating with others, we preferentially use marker traits like dialect and language to distinguish potential models and then preferentially target our cultural learning and social interactions toward those who share our dialect. My point is that trying to understand the evolution of human anatomy, physiology, and psychology without considering culture-gene coevolution would be like studying the evolution of fish while ignoring the fact that fish live and evolved underwater. To bring the ideas together that I've developed in this book, let me now pose a series of key questions and lay out my answers. Why are humans unique? Of course, humans are different from other animals in myriad ways that are related to our physiology, anatomy, and psychology. We humans are impressive endurance runners, throwers, trackers, communicators, with either spoken or gestural languages, food sharers, teachers, tool makers, cooks, causal model builders, mind readers, and ritual performers, just to name a few. However, rather than picking a particular product, like language, cooperation, or tool making, and then backing out an evolutionary story, I began this book by focusing on a type of evolutionary process, culture-gene coevolution, and then sought to track down its implications for our species. The answer to why humans are different is that we crossed the Rubicon. Cultural evolution became cumulative, and then both this accumulating body of information and its cultural products, like fire and food-sharing norms, developed as the central driving force in human genetic evolution. We seem so unique because no other living animal has gone down this road, and those that did, such as Neanderthals, were replaced during one of our species' many expansions. In earlier chapters, I've sought to explain how culture-gene coevolution gave rise to that impressive list. Thus, the key to understanding our uniqueness lies in understanding the process, not in highlighting particular products of that process, like languages, cooperation, or tools. Having crossed the Rubicon, we can't go back. The impact of this transition is underlined by the fact that, despite our long evolutionary history as foragers, we generally can't survive by hunting and gathering when we have been stripped of that relevant, culturally acquired know-how. We saw big-brained explorers repeatedly flounder in environments ranging from the Arctic to the Australian outback. As our heroes sought to confront the recurrent challenges faced by our Paleolithic ancestors, like finding food and water, they struggled. No foraging modules fired up, and no fire-making instincts kicked in. Mostly, they just fell ill and died as a result of blunders that any local, indigenous adolescent, equipped with cultural know-how inherited from earlier generations, would have easily avoided. It's not merely that people in modern societies need culture to survive. Hunter-gatherers, as well as other small-scale societies studied by anthropologists, are massively dependent on large bodies of culturally acquired know-how related to tracking, food processing, hunting, and tool manufacture. This expertise is often complex, well adapted to local challenges, and not causally well understood by most practitioners. Remember cassava processing to remove the cyanide, corn ash mixtures to prevent pellagra, and Fuegian arrow manufacturing. All humans' societies, whether they live as hunter-gatherers or not, are entirely dependent on culture. As I noted at the outset of this chapter, humans are at the beginning of a major biological transition, the formation of a new kind of animal. In our species, the extent and sophistication of our technical repertoire and of our ecological dominance depends on the size and interconnectedness of our collective brains. In turn, our collective brains depend heavily on the packages of social norms and institutions that weave together our communities, create interdependence, foster solidarity, and subdivide our cultural information and labor. These social norms, which were gradually selected by intergroup competition over eons, have domesticated us to be better rule followers, as well as more attentive parents, loyal mates, good friends, reciprocators, and understanding community members. Like the cells in our bodies, all human societies possess a division of labor and information, with different subgroups specializing in different tasks and cultural knowledge. The extent of this division and the interdependence it creates continues to expand. Similarly, most human societies possess institutions that make group-level decisions that strongly influence the long-term survival and reproduction of their members, and even sacrifice some members in pursuit of group goals. It appears that, as with the emergence of individual organisms from collections of cells, culture-driven genetic evolution is gradually shaping our societies into superorganisms of a sort. Why are humans so cooperative compared to other animals? Once cultural learning evolved to the point where people could acquire social behaviors, motivations, and rules for judging others' behavior, norms emerged spontaneously. This makes the shared recognition of how people should behave possible and permits the flow of reputational information among individuals who share those standards. At this point, genes had to survive in a dynamic social landscape in which different groups were doing different things, and failure to do those things properly, performing a ritual or sharing food, meant facing reputational damage, diminished mating prospects, ostracism, and, in the extreme, execution by the group. Natural selection shaped our psychology to make us docile, ashamed at norm violations, and adept at acquiring and internalizing social norms. This is the process of self-domestication. The differences among groups created by cultural evolution and social norms would have created intergroup competition if it hadn't already existed. Various forms of intergroup competition, only one of which involves violence, increasingly favored social norms that fostered success in this competition, which would have commonly included norms that increase group size, solidarity, social interconnectivity, cooperation, economic production, internal harmony, and risk sharing, among other domains. This process meant that genes would increasingly find themselves fighting to survive in a world of pro-social norms, where narrowly self-interested norm violations were punished. This would have favored genes for a pro-social psychology, prepared for navigating a world where norms about harm and fairness toward fellow community members were likely to be important. In Chapter 11, I described hints of these effects from experiments with babies younger than 9 months old. To most effectively construct pro-social norms, cultural evolution often harnesses, extends, or sometimes suppresses aspects of our innate psychology. In Chapter 9, we discussed how cultural evolution has repeatedly constructed norms that harness our kin psychology, pair bonding instincts, and incest aversion to weave an expanded kinship network that includes affinal relatives, classificatory brothers and sisters, and uncles whom we call father. We also discussed that cultural evolution can reinforce our pair bonding psychology to make better fathers, or suppress that psychology and eliminate any social role for a child's genetic father. The threat of reputational damage and punishment created by social norms for kinship and reciprocity favors genes that further enhanced our evolved kin and reciprocity psychologies. This is how we became more cooperative than other species, at both the level of family and friends, as well as at the levels of communities and tribes. Of course, this also creates an enduring tension between these levels that continues to pervade modern life and institutions, and establishes one of the major challenges to well-functioning organizations, governments, and states. Thus, human societies vary so much in the scale and intensity of their cooperation because different societies have culturally evolved different social norms. Such norms have profound psychological effects, often by tapping into innate mechanisms that modify our motivations, hormones, judgments, and perceptions, making us more or less cooperative in different contexts. Overall, this culture-gene coevolutionary process meets the key challenges to explaining the particular nature of human cooperation. It not only accounts for why our species is so much more cooperative than others, but it also explains why human cooperation, 1, varies so much across societies and behavioral domains, for example, food sharing, community defense, ritual participation, etc. 2, has increased so dramatically in the last 10,000 years. 3, is so readily influenced by cultural learning. 4, relies on the same reputational enforcement mechanisms operating in many non-cooperative domains like ritual practices and food taboos, and 5 is sustained by quite different systems of incentives across societies, variously involving rewards, punishments, signals of quality, and selective exploitation of norm violators. Why do we seem so smart compared to other animals? The first thing to realize is that you are much smarter than you would otherwise be, because you've tapped into and downloaded an immense repository of mental apps from a vast pool of culturally inherited know-how and practices. The full list of things I've discussed is rather long and is scattered over many chapters. Here's a brief list of a few of the mental tools you have at your disposal, which you never would have figured out on your own. Base 10 counting, fractions, temporal partitions, minutes, hours, days, etc., pulleys, fire, wheels, levers, 11 basic color terms, wind power, writing, elastic energy, multiplication, reading, kites, writing, a variety of knots, 3D spatial reference systems, and subordinating conjunctions. And, as I noted in Chapter 16, while some of these are installed in your brain as firmware, some are now hardware. Since you can likely read, we can bet that your corpus callosum, the information highway connecting your brain hemispheres, is thicker than it might otherwise be. Now, if we were to begin moving back in time, century by century, picking adults at random from all living humans and seeing what culturally acquired mental tools they had in their heads, we'd find that the ones now in your head would gradually disappear. Often, we'd find other very cool mental tools and abilities, such as the mental abacus, improved underwater vision, tons of subtle farming heuristics, mental maps for spotting animal tracks, and an acute sense of smell. As I've noted, many of these mental tools come with some costs. For example, acquiring 11 basic color terms improves our ability to distinguish between colors with different verbal labels, although it also degrades our ability to distinguish shades with the same label. And although biological categories can highlight important relationships — penguins are a type of bird, so they lay eggs — these categories can also conceal other relationships. Penguins are aquatic, so they have solid bones, unlike most other birds. Nevertheless, it's still the case that past peoples would be less good at doing many of the things we now think are smart. For example, if we measured IQ scores and scaled them using today's scale, we'd find that at our second stop, in 1815, the average American would have an IQ below 70. Recall that we discussed just how well less enculturated humans, that is, children, performed against apes, both young and old. If humans were equipped with more powerful genetically installed hardware, we'd expect that these kids, who have much bigger brains than the apes they were competing against, would have mopped up the floor with their hairy brethren. Instead, they mostly tied in a wide range of cognitive domains. Where the kids did excel was in the domain of social learning, as we discussed in both Chapter 2 and again in the cumulative cultural transmission experiments in Chapter 12. Of course, as the kids get older and have time to download those aforementioned apps, they will rapidly surpass the apes in all the cognitive domains. The young apes, by contrast, will get older but no better at these cognitive tasks. This, of course, raises the question of where all these elaborate psychological tools, complex artifacts, and training regimes that make us smarter come from, if not from the genius of individual minds. The answer is that they arose via cumulative cultural evolution from our collective brains, often without anyone realizing what was going on. Because of the combination of our powerful cultural learning and our sociality, information in the form of ideas, tools, practices, insights, and mental models can flow among individuals, recombine with other such information, and gradually improve as the selective filters of human learning, reproductive success, and intergroup competition toss some stuff on the trash heap of history and push other stuff onward to the next generation. Unique feats of genius are rare, since once the tectonic forces of cumulative cultural evolution have closed the knowledge gap to a point where one person can step across, intellectual histories show that multiple people often independently manage to take that step. I illustrated the importance of the size and social interconnectedness of collective brains in Tasmania, northern Greenland, and Oceania, as well as in the laboratory. Not only do larger collective brains generate more and faster cumulative cultural evolution, but if the size or interconnectivity of a group suddenly shrinks, that group can collectively begin losing cultural know-how over generations. This all means that the power of a group's collective brain depends on its social norms and institutions. This is why, in chapters 9 and 10, I emphasized the importance of affinal relatives, in-laws, and both exchange and ritual ties in hunter-gatherers, because it's these culturally constructed relationships, not genealogical relatedness, that nourish and enlarge their group's collective brains. Thus, these kinds of social institutions are part of the reason why expanding populations, such as speakers of the Pama-Nyungan, Inuit, and Numik languages, had and maintained a technological advantage over those they replaced. In humans, sociality and technological know-how are intimately interwoven. Of course, we humans do have superior abilities to build causal models of how the world works. But we should ask why. My view is that first, cultural evolution began producing increasingly complex practices and technologies, which involved things like chemical reactions, burnt seashells in maize, compressed air, blowguns, aerodynamics, straight, smooth spears, extended moment arms, spear throwing, and elastic energy, bows, just to name a few. To be able to more effectively learn and retransmit these valuable bits of culture, our species needed to be able to back out or reverse engineer what I've called mini-causal models. These help the learner in adapting to a variety of circumstances, make sure he or she is achieving the required goals or sub-goals for the task. For example, straightening a spear shaft often requires a complex process involving soaking, heating, rubbing, and polishing. The learner has to understand that the procedure is in the service of straightening, balancing, and smoothing the spear, because straighter, smoother, and more balanced spears can be reliably thrown with greater accuracy. With this in mind, someone crafting a spear can periodically examine the shaft for smoothness, balance, and straightness, and also test its flight for accuracy. If it's not accurate, she knows what to do: more rubbing and polishing. That's the beginning of a causal model, because it realizes that this protocol causes, or is supposed to cause, straightness, smoothness, and balance, and these characteristics are then supposed to cause predictable flight patterns that favor greater accuracy. The point is that being able to construct or acquire these mini-models of causality evolved genetically because it improved cultural transmission. The selective pressures that drove this evolutionary process were produced by the emergence of increasingly complex tools, practices, and technologies. By this view, the ability to construct many causal models didn't cause fancy tools and practices. The cultural evolution of increasingly sophisticated tools and practices first drove the emergence of this cognitive ability, and then the two entered into a culture-gene co-evolutionary duet. Consistent with this, we discussed how observing a demonstrator use an artifact fired up our causal inference machinery more readily than the world simply presenting us with the same causal information. Overall, we are smarter than other animals for a bunch of reasons, both cultural and genetic, but the ultimate causal explanation is that our species found a bridge across the Rubicon, and cumulative cultural evolution finally got some traction on the other side. So, yes, we are smart, but not because we stand on the shoulders of giants, or are giants ourselves. We stand on the shoulders of a very large pyramid of hobbits. The hobbits do get a bit taller as the pyramid ascends, but it's still the number of hobbits, not the height of particular hobbits, that's allowing us to see farther. Is all this still going on? Yes, all of this is still going on. Cumulative cultural evolution, intergroup competition, and culture-gene co-evolution still continue and have only accelerated in the last 10 millennia. With the stabilization of global climates 10,000 years ago and the increased ease of food production, intergroup competition intensified to foster new institutional forms, leading to larger and larger societies with more and more people. This competition eventually favored the rise and diffusion of new social norms favoring trust, fairness, and cooperation with strangers, which were sustained by a diversity of increasingly complex political, religious, and social institutions. Politically, these involved institutions like laws, courts, judges, and police, which backstopped the usual community-level monitoring and punishment that had dominated small-scale human societies for eons. In the domain of religion, new packages of supernatural beliefs, rituals, and norms emerged, spread, and recombined. Over time, these processes gave rise to novel high gods, who were morally concerned about behavior among co-religionists, even strangers, and increasingly better equipped to monitor, omniscience, and punish, for example hell, norm violators. New communal rituals developed and spread that combined cues of prestige and conformity with credibility-enhancing displays, creds, to deepen faith in these new gods and to build larger communities of belief that extended beyond the local community or the tribe. The consequence is that modern religions, just like our political institutions, are quite unlike the religions and rituals that existed for most of our species' evolutionary history, although they were all created by the same cultural evolutionary processes. For social institutions, some ancient societies even began to develop a package of social norms that fostered and enforced rules that limited the number of wives a man, even a rich one, could have to just one, at a time. This is odd, given that 85% of human societies permit men to marry multiple wives. By exploiting various aspects of human psychology, normative monogamous marriage may have spread because it suppressed male-male competition within societies, which reduces crime, violence, rape, and murder, while increasing infant health and survival, in part by increasing male investment in children. More on this in a moment. What is striking about institutions in the modern world, such as those related to marriage and religion, is that most people still don't understand how or why these institutions work, or how they harness aspects of our innate psychology and alter our brains and biology. Not much has changed on this front. Technologically, of course, these larger societies, which were often interconnected by trade and migration, especially along latitudinal lines, had larger collective brains and so continued to accumulate increasingly complex tools, technologies, practices, and bodies of know-how. This can be seen by comparing the most complex technological suites found on each continent around 1500 CE. By far, Eurasia had the most complex tools and accumulation of know-how, which arose in part from the synergistic cultural exchanges between places in the Middle East, China, India, and Europe. At the other end were Australia and New Guinea. Australia is the smallest continent, a situation further accentuated by its arid interior deserts, and New Guinea is a mini-continent, or really a very big island. In the middle were North and South America, which is large, but has a north-south orientation that is further exacerbated by the extreme narrowing at the Darien Gap in Panama, which impedes land travel even today, and by various mountains and deserts. Until international trade fully opened the oceans and made them highways, our collective brains were constrained by the sizes and geography of our continents. It bears emphasizing that once the body of know-how becomes sufficiently complex, cultural evolution will often favor an increasingly complex division of labor, really a division of information. In this new world, the size of the collective brain will be influenced by the size and interconnectedness of people at the knowledge frontier, the place at which individuals know enough to have any chance of making improvements on existing forms. For example, suppose I wanted to improve my iPhone, which is running slow. I could probably figure out how to pry it open, though that's not obvious, and I could start monkeying around with stuff inside. I'd probably try spraying WD-40 multi-purpose lubricant inside to see if that helps. It seems to work on my lawnmower. This approach, however, is unlikely to be successful. The point is that once things get complex, it's pretty hard for the uninformed to improve complex technologies, even with luck. Thus, in more complex societies, technological accumulations will depend heavily on the size and interconnectedness of the subpopulation at the knowledge frontier. That is, the number of people who know enough to potentially take the next baby step or to recognize a lucky mistake. Getting lots of people to the knowledge frontier will depend on the particular cultural transmission institutions, that is, the educational institutions, of the society. Once we understand the importance of collective brains, we begin to see why modern societies vary in their innovativeness. It's not the smartness of individuals or the formal incentives. It's the willingness and ability of large numbers of individuals at the knowledge frontier to freely interact, exchange views, disagree, learn from each other, build collaborations, trust strangers, and be wrong. Innovation does not take a genius or a village. It takes a big network of freely interacting minds. Achieving this depends on people's psychology, which arises from a package of social norms and beliefs, along with the formal institutions they foster or permit. With the spread of the Internet, our collective brains have the potential to expand dramatically, although differences in languages will still prevent a truly global collective brain. The other challenge to expanding our collective brains on the Internet is the same one that we've always faced, the cooperative dilemma of sharing information. Without social norms or some sort of institutions, self-interest will favor individuals who cream off all the good ideas and insights from the web without posting their own good ideas and novel recombinations for others to use. Right now, there seem to be sufficient incentives, often based on acquiring prestige, but that may change as new strategies spread that allow people to get the informational benefits without paying the costs. A key issue will be the degree to which pro-social norms for information sharing can be sustained on the Internet over the long run. Finally, my undergraduates sometimes ask me if human evolution has stopped or reversed. Their intuition is that natural selection operates on our genes to better adapt individuals to survive in their environments. Since the products of recent cultural evolution now permit us to cure once deadly infectious diseases, fix once disabling torn knee ligaments, and artificially inseminate once infertile couples, natural selection somehow isn't acting to better adapt us to the natural world, the world without culture. The answer is, of course, that natural selection certainly has not stopped. It has merely changed direction. This, however, is not something new. To throw this question into stark relief, realize that early Homo, or Homo erectus, could have asked the same question. These apes were gradually losing their big teeth, powerful jaw muscles, and large digestive systems while they were becoming addicted to high-quality foods and food processing technologies, which required the know-how to find tubers and involved manufactured cutting tools and, at some point, fire and cooking. Some precocious erectus, with the same confusion as some of my students, might have worried that natural selection had stopped or reversed because stone tools and fire were now doing the work that their powerful jaw muscles and big teeth once did. The effect of culture on human genetic evolution is not new. Cultural evolution is just, once again, sending our species' genetic evolution off in some new direction, down a coevolutionary alley that no other species has yet experienced. How does this change how we study history, psychology, economics, and anthropology? All this means that to understand human behavior, we need to untangle the ways in which psychology, biology, culture, genes, and history are intertwined. Perhaps the first step is to recognize that people who experience very different institutions, technologies, languages, and religions, just to name a few key domains, will be both psychologically and biologically different, even if they are not genetically different. Ample experimental evidence already shows us how growing up in different culturally constructed environments alters our visual perception, fairness motivations, patience, responses to honor threats, analytic thinking, tendency to cheat, frame, dependence, overconfidence, and endowment biases. And all these psychological differences are in some way biological differences. Thus, to explain much of human psychology, and certainly much of the content of current textbooks of psychology, one needs to establish the causal interconnections between the various products of cultural evolution, like institutions, for example, monogamous marriage, and technologies, for example, reading, and features of our brains, biology, genes, and psychology. For example, as I mentioned, getting married in a monogamous society lowers a man's testosterone, reduces his probability of committing a crime, increases his aversion to risk, and may strengthen his ability to defer gratification. In polygamous societies, many poor men cannot get married because the high-status men attract most of the women as first, second, and third wives. So the crime rates for these unmarried poor men go up, not down. Meanwhile, married men in polygamous societies probably don't have the drop in testosterone because, unlike married men in monogamous societies, they are still openly and actively on the marriage market, and testosterone is linked to the pursuit of female romantic partners. This means that monogamous marriage may act as a kind of society-wide testosterone suppression system. As I mentioned, the psychological effects created by this unusual package of marriage norms may be precisely the reason for its successful global spread in the last few hundred years. On the technology side, as we discussed in Chapter 16, highly literate people, who were rare until relatively recently in human history, have some neuronal rewiring, longer verbal memories, greater brain activation for spoken language, and some losses in the domain of face recognition. The details of writing systems clearly evolved to fit the genetically specified architecture of our brains, but it's worth asking what the implications were when reading, and its related neurological changes, first became widespread due to the religious convictions that rapidly spread with Protestantism and the printing press in the run-up to the Industrial Revolution. This changed the brains of many people while opening the cultural transmission pathways among the numerous writers and readers in Europe for the first time. The result was a sudden expansion of collective brains. Can this help us build stuff? When politicians, CEOs, generals, or economists design new laws, organizations, counterterrorism plans, or policies, they inevitably import implicit assumptions about human nature. These assumptions often come from a combination of their own life experiences, personal introspection, and our cultural folk beliefs, which often seem rooted in the dreams of some Enlightenment philosopher. Such assumptions have a big impact. Let's look at some examples. In Iraq, in the aftermath of the American military victory in 2003, many assumed that once freed from the dictatorial oppression of Saddam Hussein and presented with new state-of-the-art political and economic institutions imported from the United States and Europe, Iraqis would rapidly take to these institutions and start acting like people in Ohio. That did not happen, probably in part because new formal institutions and organizations have to fit with people's social norms, informal institutions, and cultural psychology. Aiming to reduce deadly diarrhea, malaria, or sexually transmitted infections, public health specialists have long emphasized the need for education. Many in public health are, or were, committed to the idea that if people just have the facts, they will behave in sensible ways, meaning they will use toilets, wash their hands, sleep under bed nets, and use condoms. Empirically, however, what surely doesn't work in case after case is providing people with the facts, or education, in part because we are selective cultural learners who evolved to acquire practices and respond to social norms. The framing of the message and the messenger are crucial, but the many causal models, the facts, are merely secondary, only necessary to support any acquired practices or social norms. In Haifa, daycare centers wanted to get parents to pick up their children on time. At 6 of these centers, fines were imposed on late parents, following typical prescriptions from economics. If people respond to incentives, then fewer parents should come late if they will be fined. In response, the rate of late parents doubled. 12 weeks later, when the fine was revoked, parents still kept picking up their children just as late and did not return to the pre-fine levels. That is, the fine made things a lot worse. Adding a fine had apparently changed the implicit social norm, making arriving late merely something that could be purchased with a fee instead of a violation of an interpersonal social obligation that induces shame, embarrassment, or empathy for the staff. I suspect a better approach would have been to go the other way, reinforcing the interpersonal obligation with an explicit social norm and enriching the relationship between the parents and a care staff. Underlying these failures is the assumption that we, as humans, all perceive the world similarly, want the same things, pursue these things based on our beliefs, the facts about the world, and process new information and experience in the same way. We already know all these assumptions are wrong. In Chapter 14, we discussed that East Asians' perceptual judgments were different from those of Euro-Americans, and that each group struggled neurologically in perceptual tasks that the other did not. In Chapter 8, I discussed how and why Angelina Jolie's op-ed flooded medical systems from the United Kingdom to New Zealand with women seeking genetic tests, even though it did not increase anyone's knowledge about either breast cancer or genetic testing. We also discussed how exactly the same hallway bump fired up men raised in the Deep South, readying them for aggression and violence, while Northerners blew it off. It seems likely that the Northerners wouldn't have predicted the behavior of their classmates from the South, unless they had spent substantial time there visiting. In Chapter 11, we discussed that social norms become automatic and intuitive motivations, literally wired into our brains. Once we understand humans as a cultural species, the toolbox for designing new organization, policies, and institutions begins to look quite different. Here are 8 insights drawn from this book. 1. Humans are adaptive cultural learners who acquire ideas, beliefs, values, social norms, motivations, and worldviews from others in their communities. To focus our cultural learning, we use cues of prestige, success, sex, dialect, and ethnicity, among others, and especially attend to particular domains, such as those involving food, sex, danger, and norm violations. We do this especially under uncertainty, time pressure, and stress. If you doubt the power of cultural learning, remember the celebrity copycat suicides in Chapter 4. 2. However, we aren't suckers. To adopt costly practices or non-intuitive beliefs, such as eating a strange food or believing in life after death, we demand credibility-enhancing displays, creds. Our models must endure costs, such as extreme pain or big financial hits, that demonstrate their deep commitment to their expressed beliefs or practices. Creds can turn pain into pleasure and make martyrs into the most powerful of cultural transmitters. 3. Humans are status seekers and are strongly influenced by prestige. But what's highly flexible is which behaviors or actions lead to high prestige. People will grant others great prestige for being fierce warriors or gentle nuns. Remember St. Ambrose, who convinced rich Romans in late antiquity that they had to give their wealth to the poor. Only by giving generously would they prove themselves worthy of the kingdom of heaven. Of course, before Ambrose began this campaign, he gave away most of his substantial wealth, a cred. 4. The social norms we acquire often come with internalized motivations and ways of viewing the world, guiding our attention and memory, as well as with standards for judging and punishing others. People's preferences and motivations are not fixed, and a well-designed program or policy can change what people find desirable, automatic, and intuitive. 5. Social norms are especially strong and enduring when they hook into our innate psychology. For example, social norms for fairness toward foreigners, will be much harder to spread and sustain than those that demand mothers care for their children. Throughout this book, I've discussed norms that have locked into various innate aspects of our psychology, including our favoritism toward close kin, aversion to incest, preference for reciprocity, readiness to avoid meat, and desire for pair bonding. As we discussed, rituals have also evolved culturally to powerfully tap many innate aspects of our psychology. 6. Innovation depends on the expansion of our collective brains, which themselves depend on the ability of social norms, institutions, and the psychologies they create to encourage people to freely generate, share, and recombine novel ideas, beliefs, insights, and practices. 7. Different societies possess quite different social norms, institutions, languages, and technologies, and consequently they possess different ways of reasoning, mental heuristics, motivations, and emotional reactions. The imposition of new formal institutions, imported from elsewhere, on populations often create mismatches. The result is that such imposed formal institutions will work rather differently, and perhaps not at all. 8. Humans are bad at intentionally designing effective institutions and organizations, though I'm hoping that as we get deeper insights into human nature and cultural evolution, this can improve. Until then, we should take a page from Cultural Evolution's playbook and design variation and selection systems that will allow alternative institutions or organizational forms to compete. We can dump the losers, keep the winners, and hopefully gain some general insights during the process. To move forward in our quest to better understand human life, we need to embrace a new kind of evolutionary science, one that focuses on the rich interaction and coevolution of psychology, culture, biology, history, and genes. This scientific road is largely untraveled, and no doubt many obstacles and pitfalls lie ahead. But it promises an exciting journey into unexplored intellectual territories as we seek to understand a new kind of animal. This concludes The Secret of Our Success by Joseph Henrich, narrated by Jonathan Yen, a member of SAG-AFTRA. Copyright 2015 by Princeton University Press. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Joseph Henrich, care of Brockman, Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2018 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, a division of Recorded Books, which holds the copyright thereto. Please visit Tantor.com for more information on our growing library of unabridged audiobooks.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.